The morning light always felt clinical, spilling through the windows of the apartment Hana shared with Kaito. For Hana, the day didn't begin with the alarm, it began with the weight of a silent responsibility she carried for two. She moved through the kitchen with the grace of a ghost, her footsteps muffled by the plush rug she vacuumed daily. Every action she performed was a quiet testament to a devotion that had slowly become her entire identity. She whisked eggs with precision, the pan sizzling in the suffocating silence. Beside the stove, a bento box sat ready, filled with colors for a man who rarely looked at his plate. She placed a note next to his car keys, its simple message of love written in a script that was tired. Kaito eventually emerged from the bedroom, a figure defined by detachment. He moved like a stranger in a hotel, his eyes glued to the glowing screen of his smartphone. There was no greeting, no touch, not a single glance toward the woman who had spent the morning ensuring everything ran flawlessly. He sat down and ate mechanically, scrolling through feeds as coffee clouded his glasses. To Kaito, Hana's presence had become like the air in the room, essential to his survival but entirely invisible. He took the bento box and the keys without a single word of gratitude, the note fluttering to the floor as he stepped toward the front door. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. As she began to scrub the plate he had left behind, Hana's mind wandered back to a time when the apartment felt like a sanctuary. She remembered their first year together, a time filled with mutual dreams and whispered promises. They had once stood on the balcony together, planning a future where they would travel and build a life together. Back then, Kaito would surprise her with flowers just because, and they would talk for hours about the universe. The contrast between those vibrant memories and the current reality felt like a physical blow. The man who had once promised to be her partner had slowly retreated into a fortress of indifference, leaving her to maintain the ruins of what they used to be. The breaking point finally arrived on a rainy Tuesday evening, their 3-year anniversary. Hana had prepared a large feast of his favorite dishes, lit tall candles that cast a warm, hopeful glow across the dining table, and wore the silk dress Kaito had once called his favorite. She waited in the silence of the room. 1 hour passed, then 2. The candles burned low, wax dripping like slow, heavy tears onto the tablecloth. When the door finally opened, Kaito walked in with a heavy, frustrated sigh, dropping his briefcase on the floor. He didn't see the flowers, he didn't see the dress. He looked at the table and simply frowned, complaining that the salmon looked dry and the rice was cold. He had forgotten the date entirely, and more than that, he had forgotten the woman who was standing before him. An icy exhaustion settled into Hana's bones as he retreated toward the television. The profound internal conflict simmering for many months reached its boiling point. She looked at her reflection in the darkened window, seeing a woman she no longer recognized, a woman who had hollowed herself out just to fill a space that was never truly meant for her. The realization hit her with terrifying clarity. She was the only person left fighting for a relationship that had died long ago. Standing in the dim light of the kitchen, surrounded by the cold remnants of a failed celebration, Hana made a silent, monumental vow. She looked at Kaito's distant back and whispered a final goodbye he didn't even hear. She would stop trying to save them. From this moment on, she would let the silence have its way. The silence that followed wasn't the suffocating kind that usually accompanies an argument. It was something different, a hollow, ringing void that replaced the hum of Hana's constant activity. The next morning, there was no sizzling pan, no aroma of freshly brewed coffee, and no neatly packed bento box waiting by the door. Hana no longer woke early to ensure Kaito's world was aligned. She slept until her own body decided it was time to rise, leaving him to navigate the kitchen like a sailor in uncharted waters. He found the fridge nearly empty, the milk past its date, and the bread stale. For the first time in years, the apartment felt like 4 walls and a roof rather than a home. Initially, Kaito felt a perverse sense of liberation. He had often complained about Hana's care, viewing her notes as clutter and her questions as a mild interrogation. Now the interrogation had ceased. He could come home late without seeing her expectant face at the window. He could scroll through his phone without the guilt of her waiting for a conversation. This was what he wanted: autonomy and no expectations. He enjoyed the quiet for 3 days, convinced that Hana was simply going through a phase or playing a passive-aggressive game. He expected her to break first, to come back with an apology and a home-cooked meal. However, the novelty of neglect soon began to sour. The invisible threads holding his life together were snapping. His favorite shirt remained at the bottom of the laundry. The dust began to settle on the bookshelves, and the plants in the corner started to brown, their leaves curling for want of water. The emotional temperature of the apartment plummeted. When he did see her, she was a polite shadow. She didn't ask how his meetings went. She didn't offer to rub his shoulders. She was simply there, existing in a parallel reality that no longer intersected with his own. The warmth had evaporated, leaving behind a cold, clinical efficiency. While the domestic world crumbled, Hannah herself seemed to be blooming in the wreckage. The exhaustion around her eyes faded, replaced by a quiet glow. She spent her afternoons at the local library, lost in books that had nothing to do with being a perfect partner. She reconnected with old friends, her laughter echoing through the hallways when she returned home late. Most significantly, the smell of oil paints began to waft from the spare room. She reclaimed the easel she'd tucked away to make space for his office. She painted with a ferocity that startled him, vibrant, chaotic colors that stood in stark contrast to the gray stagnation of their relationship. She was finding herself again. Kaito began to feel a gnawing sense of displacement. He was used to being the son her life revolved around. Now he was just a roommate she barely acknowledged. He tried to provoke her, leaving his dishes in the sink or making pointed comments about the lack of dinner. But Hannah simply offered a small, distant smile and suggested he try the new takeout place down the street. Her lack of anger was more terrifying than any shouting match could have been. She wasn't fighting him because she was no longer invested in the outcome. He started watching her from across the room, realizing with a jolt of panic that he didn't know the woman she was becoming. The tension finally snapped on a rainy Friday evening when Kaito returned to find her dressed up, not for him, but for a gallery opening. He blocked the hallway, his face flushed with a mix of confusion and wounded pride. He demanded to know what was happening, why she was acting so cold, and why she had stopped caring about them. Hannah looked at him with a profound, weary clarity. She told him calmly that she hadn't stopped caring about him as a person. She explained that she had simply stopped caring about the version of us that only existed in her head. She had finally let go of the rope, and as she walked out, Kaito realized the silence was never going to end. Kaito's reaction to the gallery opening and Hannah's declaration was one of sheer, unadulterated panic. The very next day, the apartment was filled with things he thought would fix the fractured foundation of their shared existence. He bought a massive, towering bouquet of white peonies, her favorite, or so he vaguely remembered from their first year together, and left them in a heavy crystal vase on the kitchen island where she couldn't miss them. When that elicited nothing more than a polite, "Faspudi, distant nod of thanks, he began to escalate. He made reservations at the most expensive, exclusive restaurant in the city, the kind of place that required months of waiting and a formal dress code. He presented her with a small velvet-lined box containing a delicate diamond pendant that caught the morning light with a cold, hard brilliance. He was suddenly performing the role of the devoted partner with a frantic intensity that bordered on the grotesque. He followed her from room to room, offering to make her tea, asking detailed questions about her day, and trying to manufacture an intimacy he had spent the last 3 years systematically dismantling with his own indifference. Hannah watched this performance with a detached, aching sort of sadness. Every gift felt like a bribe to return to a life that had slowly suffocated her. She realized with painful clarity that Kaito wasn't actually seeing her now any more than he had when he was ignoring her. He wasn't mourning the loss of her spirit, her unique humor, or the dream she had put on hold. He was mourning the sudden loss of his own domestic comfort. He missed the woman who anticipated his every need and made his life effortless, not the woman who now stood before him with paint-stained fingers and a newfound sense of self. His grand gestures were hollow, fueled by the terrifying realization that he might actually have to learn how to exist without her constant quiet support. It wasn't love that drove his sudden change of heart. It was the frantic, selfish survival instinct of a man who realized his golden cage was finally, irrevocably empty. The inevitable confrontation occurred on another rainy evening, the sound of the downpour drumming against the glass windows like a rhythmic, relentless countdown. Kaito found her in the bedroom, staring out at the blurred city lights while the shadows grew long across the floor. He dropped to his knees, clutching her hand with a desperation that would have moved her to tears just 6 months ago. He begged for another chance, promising that everything would be different, that he would finally be the man she deserved. He spoke of their future, of a house by the sea, and of the travel plans they had once discussed in the early days of their romance. He threw every desperate promise against the wall to see if any of it would stick. Hana gently pulled her hand away, the touch as light and final as a falling leaf. She sat him down and explained the concept of the quiet quit. She told him that the version of her that used to cry over his coldness had died a long time ago. She had checked out of their shared life in slow, agonizing stages, like a candle flickering until there was no wick left to relight. There was no anger in her voice, only a devastating final clarity. The fire hadn't been smothered by a sudden event. It had simply burned through all its fuel until only ash remained. The following morning, the apartment felt like a sterile museum of a life she no longer lived. Hana began to pack her belongings into a few sturdy boxes. It wasn't a scene of cinematic rage or dramatic flair. She moved with a rhythmic, peaceful efficiency, folding her silk dresses and wrapping her vibrant oil paintings in protective brown paper. Each item removed from the shelves made the space feel larger and more hollow. Kaito watched from the doorway, a ghost in his own home, unable to find the words to stop a process that was already complete. When she finally picked up her suitcase and closed the front door behind her, the soft click of the lock was the loudest, most definitive sound he had ever heard. Kaito sat on the floor of the darkened living room long after she had gone, the weight of the absolute silence finally crushing him. He looked at the empty spaces on the walls where her art had hung and felt the agonizing chill of the loneliness Hana had endured while sitting right next to him for years. Outside, the rain finally stopped, giving way to the first pale, bruised colors of a new dawn. Hana walked down the street, her footsteps light against the damp pavement. She didn't look back at the windows of the apartment they had shared. As the sun crested the horizon, painting the city in brilliant shades of gold and amber, she felt a profound sense of liberation. She understood now that stopping wasn't a failure or a sign of weakness. It was the ultimate act of self-love, a necessary end that allowed her to finally, truly begin again.